Couple of odd things about Trump's border wall speech last night. First of all, just the very outlandish, Kafkaesque absurdness of a country that spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year on the Department of Defense being unable to scrounge together a mere $5 billion to build a wall is really quite astonishing and quite astounding. And when you kind of get the big perspective of how insane that is, you'll realize just how far the government has drifted from anything to do with the wishes or preferences or desires of the people it forces to pay for its largesse. That was one. The second, of course, was watching the cadaver twins from hell making a speech, Pelosi and Schumer, where it's sort of like watching an alien trying to wear a human flesh suit, watching Democrats try and talk about not wanting to spend money on inefficient programs, inefficient things. It really is quite delightful to watch. But we're going to go through the speech here fairly briefly and just talk about some of the facts, because, you know, fact-checking was pretty important and everybody was doing it. So Trump said that he wanted to talk about a humanitarian and security crisis at the southern border. And he says everyday customs and border protection agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back home to their country. America proudly welcomes millions of lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation, but all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal migration. Okay, so, I mean, there's interesting things there, which is he immediately needs to start justifying distancing himself from any kind of accusations of xenophobia or nationalism or anything like that. So, we're out of space to hold them, no way to promptly return them back home to their country. Okay, so if you had lots of space to hold them and you could somehow find a way to return them back home to their country, would that be okay? Right, so again, it's one of these things. I'm not a politician, and you'll see during this particular presentation exactly why. And then he has to say, look, I'm fine with immigration, I just don't like illegal immigration, which is something that we'll get to in a sec. And the idea that all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal immigration, no, that they're not. In fact, the Democrats are enormously enriched by uncontrolled illegal migration. That's why they like it. I mean, you understand, as everybody does, I'm sure, that if illegal aliens from Mexico voted for the Republicans, you'd already have a wall along the southern border that would be visible from space. And this is why they're very keen on pseudo-refugees from the Middle East, but genuine white farmer refugees from South Africa are not welcome because they're likely to vote for Republicans. So, yeah, Americans are enormously benefited by uncontrolled illegal migration, the Democrats for votes, and to some degree the Department of Commerce for cheap labor, because what happens is the illegal aliens who come to America drive down the wages even for legal workers. So there's that. And of course, they prevent a lot of poor kids from getting a start up the economic ladder by taking over jobs that used to be done by American teenagers. So you kind of have to say, well, there are lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation. And yeah, well, it's not really true. It's not true at all. I'll put the sources to this below. So, this is 2012. I'm sure the number is even worse now. 51% of households headed by an immigrant, legal or illegal, reported that they used at least one welfare program during the year, compared to 30% of native households. So welfare is Medicaid and cash, food, and housing programs. And again, if you further differentiate this out by race, then you have whites using the welfare state relatively little, East Asians using it even less, Hispanics more, blacks even more. So, yeah, it's close to twice the use. Welfare use is high for both new arrivals and well-established immigrants. Of households headed by immigrants who have been in the country for more than 2 decades, 48% of them access welfare. 20 years after they come to the country, just about half of them are still using welfare or accessing welfare. Yeah, I mean, so it's a nation of immigrants. Not really. I mean, it's like saying Canada's a nation of immigrants. You know, the people who came here had a lot of babies. It wasn't really a nation of immigrants. But even if we say that it was, in the 19th century, people came for freedom. Now they come for free stuff. It's a totally different selection mechanism. It has nothing to do with what happened in the past. In the past, you came off the boat, you went through Ellis Island, you had your turn and cough check for communicable diseases, and then you were turned loose to make it or break it as you saw fit, and as your community would support you, and as the value that you could add to the economy manifested. That's not the case anymore. It's not, I mean, the people who come across the border, particularly from the South, immigrants immediately get into massive in-group preference ethnic groups that tell them exactly how to access as many welfare programs as humanly possible. So this idea that, yeah, I guess there are millions of lawful immigrants who enrich society, contribute to our nation. Yeah, there's some of those. But there's a lot of the other kind. And again, Trump has to say that. I wouldn't say that, which is why I'm not a politician. So the data says no single program explains immigrants' higher overall welfare use. For example, not counting subsidized school lunch, welfare use is still 46% for immigrants and 28% for natives. Not counting Medicaid, welfare use is 44% for immigrants and 26% for natives. Immigrant households have much higher use of food programs, 40% versus 22% for natives, and Medicaid, 42% versus 23%. Immigrant use of cash programs is similar, as is use of housing programs. And not all immigrant groups are the same. And we can see, if you've heard me talk about IQ and the IQ hierarchy, you'll know exactly why this is the case. Households headed by immigrants from Central America and Mexico, 73% of them use welfare. 73%, almost 3 out of every 4 households. The Caribbean, 51% use welfare. Africa, 48%. These have the highest overall welfare use. Those from East Asia, 32% on welfare, using welfare. Europe, 26%, and South Asia, 17% have the lowest. So, yeah, I mean, immigration is ungodly costly for Americans as a whole. And this doesn't even, it's just welfare usage. This doesn't even count congestion. This doesn't even count driving up housing prices. This doesn't even count the costs of having to babble fish your way through every known language on the planet in order to get anything done. None of that is counted. And driving down wages and so on, right? Anyway, so, I mean, as far as immigration goes, first step I would take is say, okay, well, we're going to have immigration agreements that are the same as the originating country. So if Americans don't have the right to move to China, then Chinese don't have the right to move to America. And so I think this is what I talked about when I was on tour in Australia. Chinese people are buying up massive amounts of land in Australia, but Australians are barely allowed to own any land in China. So you just say, yeah, you know, we're going to have reciprocal agreements. If we can't move to your country and access welfare in your country, then you can't move to our country and access welfare in our country. It's just basic reciprocal agreements. You don't keep sending iPads to someone who never sends you any money back to pay for them. You just have reciprocal agreements. And it's not a perfect solution, but it would be a start, and it's certainly defensible morally. I mean, if you can't move to Saudi Arabia and go on welfare, then should Saudi Arabians be allowed to move to America and go on welfare? Well, of course not. I mean, this is basic self-defense, basic self-protection, basic reciprocal agreements. It's the same. Yeah, can you move to India and immediately go on welfare? No. Well, I mean, people in Central America who are illegal aliens, they can't even go into a bank and change money. They can't get a cell phone agreement. The utilities won't hook them up. I mean, come on. Now, people did nag Trump a lot because of Mexico is going to pay for the wall and so on. Like, I don't think that's the most important thing, whether Mexico pays for the wall. I know it was a good campaign promise and all of that, and there's lots of different ways to get Mexico to pay for the wall. You could put a simple tax of 10% on disbursements to Mexico. That would get you about $5 billion a year. Or what you could do is you could ban sending money overseas to people who are on welfare. Why? Because they're taking money from the American taxpayer and they're sending it overseas, which means it vanishes pretty much to value for the American economy to a large degree, right? At least if people get welfare, they spend it in America. At least there's some generation, it's some circular thing or whatever, right? And so if you take welfare from the state, should you be allowed to send money overseas? You see, welfare is supposed to be to keep you alive. And so if you're on welfare, you shouldn't have the excess money to send overseas. If you do, you don't need to be on welfare. This is the basic, right? But this would require somebody like me in politics, which is not imminent. So Trump went on to say, this illegal alien invasion. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. Now that is, again, my sympathies go out to Scott Adams enormously for his family loss, but that is every week 300 citizens killed by heroin alone. And 90% of it's coming across from the southern border. Now some people are saying, well, but it doesn't necessarily come through illegal immigration and so on. It's like, yeah, but some of it does, and it's easier to deal with. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. Isn't that astounding? Those kinds of statistics just really, really blow my mind and help me to sort of appreciate just how horrifying the situation is. And it's easier to check border points like customs points than it is to check an entire wall. So of course, even if the flood remains somewhat similar, it's then concentrated in particular areas that are easier to check. Now, of course, I dislike the drug war on moral and practical grounds. But here's the problem, right? So you have these violent drug cartels, not just composed of Hispanics, but other groups as well. You have these violent drug cartels in America at the moment. Now, the problem, of course, is that as drugs slowly get legalized, as they will, because it was a vast disaster to have a war on drugs, as these drugs get legalized, then these crime gangs are going to fight viciously amongst themselves. They're going to expand into other areas. They're going to do human trafficking because they're already there. Right, so this is a big problem. You don't want to invite more people to set up crime gangs in your country, which is more of an immigrant thing than a domestic thing as far as I understand it, because as society reforms itself over time, there'll be more and more vicious fighting that goes on. Now, when he talks about Americans dying from drugs this year that were killed in the entire Vietnam War, that should be a wake-up call, not just because of the data, but because of the reaction from other people, right? So the U.S. pays for border walls in the Middle East, and it supposedly has this Department of Defense that should be protecting Americans, and certainly the way that it stands right now, the drugs coming across the border are a kind of bioweapon against America, and so people are desperate and clamoring for some kind of defense. But if you're saying to people you've got to care about all these Americans who are dying, what it does is it exposes the swamp, right? I mean, this perma-state thing, right? The deep state. The swamp cares about power, not human life. I mean, they're happy if women abort millions of children. They fine with wars. I mean, do you remember Madeleine Albright, who was asked if she thought that the 500,000 Iraqi dead was worth it, and she said, yeah, I think it's worth it. Or Hillary Clinton about Muammar Gaddafi giggling away, saying, we saw, he died. I mean, these are real psychopaths, right? I mean, these are really terrifying people who only care about power, who only care about manipulation, who only care about control. So, of course, they don't care about Americans dying from drugs, right? Which is why you have this horrible situation where you're watching the Democrats saying, well, we don't want to waste money saving American lives. Come on. Let me just look at all the crazy stuff America, or Western governments as a whole, spend money on, and the idea that you wouldn't want to spend money on a wall is, it's crazy, right? So then Trump goes on to say, in the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records, including those charged or convicted of 100,000 assaults, 30,000 sex crimes, and 4,000 violent killings. Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. Now, I've seen some data pushbacks on this saying, well, the illegal aliens have crime rates lower than the domestic population and so on. And I always find that kind of tough to believe. I mean, if they're illegal, aren't they kind of off the grid? Isn't it really tough to figure out what's going on with crime rates and so on compared to the domestic population? So, I mean, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. But nonetheless, right? Nonetheless, if you have a certain amount of immigration and then illegal aliens come across the border, illegally, right? Then whoever they kill is in addition to whatever's going on in your country, right? So it's still more deaths, more assaults, more rapes, more sex crimes than you would have otherwise had. So now, it's funny too, because once this is sort of understood as an invasion and a pillaging and a form of chemical or biological warfare using drugs, then you understand that it's a military situation, right? The defense of the border is a military situation. And so you already have hundreds of billions of dollars assigned for defense of the United States. You don't actually need to go to the House to get money to build a wall. The wall budget is already embedded or has been allocated by military spending. And of course, if you are in the federal government, the Constitution commands you to defend the U.S. border. So this idea that you've got to go to Congress and beg for money is like, no, you just say that it's a military situation, which it is, and you simply use the existing defense budget to build a wall. That's my particular thought. Again, I'm no constitutional scholar, but anyway, he goes on to say, this is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart and a crisis of the soul. Last month, 20,000 migrant children were illegally brought into the United States, a dramatic increase. These children are used as human pawns by vicious coyotes and ruthless gangs. 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on the dangerous trek up through Mexico. Women and children are the biggest victims by far of our broken system. And that's, again, I find this kind of odd, but again, I'm no politician. So saying it has bad effects, well, but it's illegal. I mean, you enforce the law. You prevent people from coming into your country illegally. You enforce the law. Like, I don't know that you need to come up with all of these other things to say, well, here's why we should enforce the law. It's like enforce the law or repeal the law. And given that the law is on the books, you enforce the law. I don't, like, maybe I'm a little confused, but this, well, it harms blacks and Hispanics. I was like, okay, so if it didn't harm blacks and Hispanics, and it certainly doesn't harm some Hispanics because they want their families to come over the border, is it okay if it doesn't harm certain people? What if it was, what if almost no women were sexually assaulted on the dangerous trek up through Mexico? Does that mean that it's okay? I mean, I don't know. Again, he's dealing with a pretty dumbed down population, but nonetheless. So he says, this is the tragic reality of illegal immigration on our southern border. This is a cycle of human suffering that I am determined to end. My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. Again, I don't know. You're the commander-in-chief. A border is being violated. You have a multi-hundred-billion-dollar Defense Department budget. So just build the wall. I mean, what? Maybe I'm missing something here, but I mean, to take a sort of silly example, so Barack Obama has a house, I think it's in Washington, where they just finished building this huge wall. I mean, just go build the wall. I mean, you're the commander-in-chief. It's a military situation. It's an invasion. With, people have weapons, or they get weapons when they come across. They're breaking the law. It just seems kind of odd. Like, let me sort of give you an analogy. So the Tax Revenue Department, the IRS, right, the Internal Revenue Department, they have a budget for catching people who evade their taxes, right, who don't pay their taxes, who evade their taxes. They have a budget for that, right? Now, if a bunch of people aren't paying their taxes, do they have no choice but to go to Congress to ask for an increase in the budget to catch them? No. Do they say, well, we don't have the additional money to pursue people who are not paying their taxes? It's like, no, they just go and enforce. They have a budget. They just enforce the law. And if they have to cut back on other things, okay, well, they cut. It's just kind of weird to me. It just seems kind of strange. If you have a Department of Defense, people are coming across the border by the thousands, and you just build a wall to stop it. It's defense. Literally, it's defense of the country. The only thing that makes the country is the border. You have no border, you have no country. All right, so he says, our proposal was developed by law enforcement professionals and border agents at the Department of Homeland Security. These are the resources they have requested to properly perform their mission and keep America safe, in fact, safer than ever before. So, cutting-edge technology for detecting drugs, weapons, illegal contraband, and many other things. We've requested more agents, immigration judges to process the sharp rise of unlawful migration fueled by a very strong economy. Now, I don't know. I mean, I sort of hate to say it. I mean, I'm kind of a little burned out on problems all over the world that are being dealt with by the West. But it seems to me kind of strange, because if someone is in America and they don't have the documentation to prove that they have a right to be in America, you just kick them over the border. I mean, maybe I'm confused, but and then they say, well, I'm a refugee. I'm fleeing persecution. It's like, no, you're not. You're not, because if you were a refugee, then you would go to the border, you would present yourself as a refugee, and it would go through that process. But if you just end up in America and you have no legal right to be there, then you just get kicked out. I don't know what judges are all about. I mean, this is not a complicated thing. This isn't a, massive fraud investigation. I mean, it's like, like if you move, sorry, if you don't pay your bills, like if you don't pay your mortgage and the bank comes to repossess your home, I don't know that there's a massive amount of, did you pay? No, you didn't pay. So you lose your house. I mean, repossessing your car and so, like, again, it seems kind of odd that there's all of these massive, complicated legal quagmires for, like, you don't have a right to be here. Like, if I go trespass someplace and they kick me out, I mean, I got to call up a judge. And well, you were in the property without permission. Anyway. So it goes on to say, our plan also contains an urgent request for humanitarian assistance and medical support. Furthermore, we have asked Congress to close border security loopholes so that illegal immigrant children can be safely and humanely returned back home. Yeah. But of course, and it's also pretty tortuous to watch the Democrats saying how much they care about kids and they just want to do what's best for the kids. I mean, drugging endless millions of boys in government schools because government schools are catering to girls and boys find them boring and so on, to just drug kids. They don't care about kids. I mean, they support the right of women to murder countless babies in the womb every year as the idea they care about kids. Come on. And he says, finally, as part of an overall approach to border security, law enforcement professionals have requested $5.7 billion for a physical barrier. At the request of Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. This barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want and need. This is just common sense. Now, at the request of the Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. Again, I'm not sure exactly why he's deferring to what the Democrats want. It's a military situation. It's an invasion. You've got money in the Department of Defense. You build the wall. And then he says the border wall will very quickly pay for itself. The cost of illegal drugs exceeds $500 billion a year, vastly more than the $5.7 billion we have requested from Congress. The wall will also be paid for indirectly by the great new trade deal we have made with Mexico. Now, this is the kind of funny thing, right? If you were in a business and you could spend $1 to make $100, I mean, you would just do it. You'd barely even ask anyone. It would just be so obvious, right? And so the wall costs 1% of the cost of illegal drugs. Now, again, I know the wall won't eliminate that cost completely. Okay, so let's say it only eliminates 10% of that. It's still 10 times, almost 10 times return on investment. Senator Chuck Schumer, who you will be hearing from later tonight, although, funny story, you won't actually be hearing from Chuck Schumer how Israel doesn't need a wall. Funny how that works. Goes on to say, has repeatedly supported a physical barrier in the past, along with many other Democrats. They changed their mind only after I was elected president. Well, I kind of get what you're saying, but I don't think that's very true. See, the left, they lie, right? They openly say, right? Hillary Clinton was a big admirer of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, where he says, you have to tell the truth, you manipulate, you lie, like they'll just lie. So the reason they talked about a wall was to not alarm people about being open borders lunatics, right? So they just lied. I mean, it's easy to say I want a wall when the Republicans, basically aren't really going to push very hard for a wall, right? So it's fine to say, yeah, I want a wall, when there's absolutely no chance that the wall is going to come into being. Now that the wall might be coming into being, they have to change their tune, right? So it's not like they changed their mind. You know, it's sort of like if some guy says, "Oh yeah, no, I'll fight this big guy," knowing that he's in a coma. I'll fight him. Then the guy comes out of a coma, starts training, and suddenly you don't want to fight him anymore because now the fight has become real, right? So it's just a bunch of nonsense. They lied about supporting the wall so that they could get more and more immigrants, legal and illegal, or aliens, into the country. And now that they have the demographics, right? Now they have the demographic support because, as we know, I mean, immigrants from third world countries vote overwhelmingly for the left. So now the left has their demographic support, so now they can take off the mask and right? Like Ocasio-Cortez, people keep making fun of her for making goofy statements and being wrong about stuff. It's like, but she doesn't have to be right. She doesn't have to have any integrity. She doesn't have to have any honesty. She can dance and giggle and do all this kind of, because she's got a built-in voting base of people who will vote for her just because, right? She's, her ethnicity is what it is, and so people will vote for her for that. Like, why are there Muslims in Congress? Is it because the Muslims just happen to review everyone's arguments for what they wanted to do politically and decide, the woman who's got my religion, well, she's just the person I want in Congress? It's like, no. In a multicultural society, voting just turns into an ethnic head count, except for whites, right, who are never allowed to vote just for whites, because that would be being a Nazi, right? So, yeah, Ocasio-Cortez is incomprehensible to people who think you need to be true to get support, or accurate to get support, or have intelligence to get support. No, she got support from the ethnic base. And the Muslims are voted into Congress because the fellow Muslims vote for them because they're Muslims, right? It's nothing to do with any policies. It's just the way things are, right? So Trump went on to say, Democrats in Congress have refused to acknowledge the crisis, and they have refused to provide our brave border agents with the tools they desperately need to protect our families and our nation. Right, because they're protecting their source of power, which is third world demographic voting. So Trump says the federal government remains shut down for one reason and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security. My administration is doing everything in our power to help those impacted by the situation, but the only solution is for Democrats to pass a spending bill that defends our borders and reopens the government. This situation could be solved in a 45-minute meeting. I have invited congressional leadership to the White House tomorrow to get this done. Hopefully we can rise above partisan politics in order to support national security. And then here's a good line here. I said, some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside. Now, that's a good line. But no, you build walls because you fear people on the outside, right? The only thing that is immoral is that politicians do nothing and continue to allow more innocent people to be so horribly victimized. And yeah, I mean, you know, if it's totally wrong to build a wall or a fence or anything like that, then why, if you have a pool, are you legally required to have a fence around your pool? I mean, come on. I mean, everybody knows this is ridiculous, right? So then he talks about the individuals who are harmed by that, and yeah, I mean, those individual stories, good persuasion. It hits people who can't sort of process abstractions, and it's kind of a compromise to the terrible American educational system. But yeah, how much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? See, Congress really doesn't care about shedding blood. I mean, look at all the wars and foreign engagements and bombings and so on. What was 100,000 bombs dropped on Middle Eastern countries under Obama? I mean, come on. I mean, the idea that Congress cares about lives is to me not valid. Said, to those who refuse to compromise in the name of border security, I would ask, imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis. To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border. But here's the thing, right? So there is this basic reality that people in government get a lot of money because of third world demographic leftist voting patterns. Now, the people who are well off, who have power, they can afford to live in good neighborhoods. They can afford to live far away from the third world problems and the no-go zones that are creeping up all over the West. And so you see, it's a form of status. You know, I'm for third world immigration is a way of preening yourself, throwing up your peacock feathers of usually unjustly gained money and saying, well, you see, I'm wealthy enough to avoid. It's like wearing white and having, long nails, right? You wear white to show you never do any physical labor. And you totter around on high heels to show you never do any physical work. And you have long nails to say you never need to cut them for physical labor. It's a form of status signals, right? In the past, a tan was considered low class because a lot of people worked outside. Now a tan is considered high class because it shows you have the leisure to go and tan yourself. In the past, being fat was considered more attractive because food was scarce. Now food is plentiful. Being thin is more attractive. You're just showing it that you're the exception. It's a form of status signaling. It's why so many of these wealthy celebrities talk about how wonderful had taken in migrants and how wonderful immigration is while they live in gated communities in virtually all white neighborhoods. It's just a way of them saying, well, look, see, I'm wealthy enough to not deal with these poor Class A working class issues to do with mass immigration. I don't care. I've got, right? It's a pretty cold-hearted way of preening and showing your own social status. So yeah, I mean, what you're saying, right, to the leftists, oh, your child, your husband, your wife, cruelly, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to happen to those people because they live far segregated from the problems that they're creating, right? It's like that old line from 1984 where O'Brien says to Winston Smith, have some coffee. I'm afraid not much of this gets out from the inner party, right? Like have some nice coffee because, it's mostly... The people like Lenin didn't starve to death when he was inflicting basically a genocide on largely the Ukrainian white Christian kulaks. He had enough to eat. He just starved them to punish them for resisting socialism, communism, right? So, right, they're not going to be subject to these issues. But what you're saying is more like this, if you want to understand how the left hears it. So I would ask, imagine if you ended up losing your job and your status and your privilege and your dopamine hit from power, your money and your resources and people coming in and kowtowing to you and kissing your rings because I put up a wall. Imagine if you lost all of that status and power and privilege and joy and dominance and money and resources and control and bullying capacity. Like imagine if you lost all of that and had to go get a real job because I put up a wall. Well, that's how they hear it deep down, right? If a wall goes up, their grip on power is threatened. You understand? The Democrat Party no longer represents the people who built America. Right, the blacks and the whites who built America. Right, America was almost exclusively like 90% white, 10% black throughout most of its history up until the 1965 Immigration Act, where they started to switch to the third world. Right, so the Democrats no longer represent the people who built America. They no longer represent the whites and blacks who built America. They represent the third world, and they barely squeak into power even with all of this demographic propping up. So without the demographic propping up, you understand, the entire Democrat Party collapses. Without endless importation and bribery of third world voters, there is no Democrat Party. There are, in fact, no leftist parties in the West at all. There's a reason why they switched to immigration. Because after the crimes of Stalin were revealed by Khrushchev, after the cult of personality, after the massive disasters of communism were finally, they broke through the wall that was put up by leftist reporters, like to pretend that socialism and communism were wonderful. After the facts broke through, the communists, the leftists, the hard leftists, they panicked and they said, well, we can't win the argument anymore. Von Mises has destroyed the arguments for the efficiencies of Marxist economics. History has rejected the value of Marxist economics, and now it turns out that there are horrible concentration camps, millions of people starved, murdered, slaughtered in communist countries. North Korea ain't doing so well, and all of this kind of horrible stuff. So they panicked and they said, well, we can't obviously give up our ideology. We can't convince people anymore based on reason and evidence, so we'll just replace people who disagree with us with people who like free stuff, right, which is basically what Marxism and the left is all about. So, this is the wall is foundational. I mean, the wall, this is why it's such a fight. So it is going to be an awful fight. And yes, if Trump tries to use, a state of national emergency, some sort of executive action, or just declares it a national defense issue and starts to build the wall, people are going to go nuts on the left because you're threatening the existence of that which gives them life. Like they've been hollowed out as people, they're soulless, they've been hollowed out as people, and they've been filled with nothing but a base satanic lust for power and control, right? They're amoral, mammalian power seekers who will only recognize ethics as a tool to lull the gullible into believing that they have half a moral bone in their body. And so it is a desperate fight for their life, because this is the basic question that people really, you really need to think about this, mull this over, and talk about this with other people. It's very, very important. This is the basic issue that's going on here. The money for the welfare state is running out. The money is going to run out. It's not even going to be that long. The money is running out. Now, if you have a relatively high IQ population, then what happens when the money runs out is people say, for the most part, well, okay, it was a fun run, but I guess I'll go get a job. That's what people will do. And if you have a lower IQ population, or significant portions of a lower IQ population, do you know what will happen when the money runs out? You will get riots, you will get violence, you will get gangs, you will get threats, you will get terrorism, you will get all this kind of stuff. Because they can't easily, if at all, compete with higher IQ people in a meritocratic-based free market environment. They can't. So the question fundamentally is this: given that the money is going to run out, what kind of country do you want when that happens? Very foundational question. What kind of country do you want when the money runs out? Because that's really the question that the wall represents.